our fourth and final speaker before we break for lunch. Very, very excited about this one. Is everybody awake? Is everyone ready? You still going? Yeah, we are. Okay. Right, so who's up next but Russ Allen. Not that many long ago, what was it, 2020, when I first went to Egypt and I was just getting into all this. On the bus, we have many bus trips to all the different sites, and almost everyone on the bus was buzzing about this podcast called Brothers of the Serpent. They're like, oh my God, have you heard the latest episode? And I'm gonna email in, talk about that. I was like, what, the Brothers of the what now? The what? And so they introduced me on that trip to these guys' podcast, and it was amazing. And I can legitimately say it's my favorite dog walking podcast. So I've got a good 1-2 hour dog walk. I'm gonna be going around with these guys. And they also do amazing musical breaks, which is just what you need in a podcast. And he co-hosts, well, two actually, he got Brothers of the Serpent and also Cosmographia alongside Randall Carlson. And I was so humbled to be invited on. In the early days when I was starting my YouTube, the guys were awesome and reached out and let me come on, so I've always thanked them for that. They delve into persistent mysteries, seeking the truth carefully and observing and researching while being wildly entertaining. They're leading the way for like genuinely open-minded discussion on ancient mysteries. And have you ever noticed the enigma of unfinished ancient stuff just like everywhere? You can see it almost is littered everywhere around Egypt and around the world. Well, Russ has, and he's bringing us a fantastic visual presentation from his travels out in the field. It's Russ Allen.
Hey!
Thank you. So, yes, I am Russ Allen. I'm one of the hosts of the Brothers of the Serpent podcast. I host it with my brother Kyle. What I'm going to be showing you today is a series of observations that we made from our trips in Egypt, plus some things around the world. But it's basically a series of pictures from Egypt. And the other important thing to know about us for this presentation is that we've been in construction and operating heavy machinery for most of our working lives. And I think people of all professions do this, but when you're in a profession or you have a skill and you see work that someone else did with that same profession or skill, you're kind of looking at it and wondering, how'd they do that? You kind of want to know the process that they used. But of course, in Egypt, you're like, how did they do that? So that's what I'm going to take you through is a look at Egypt through the eyes of a person who builds things, who operates heavy machinery, who moves heavy loads. And there's lots of great questions. I'm also going to show you patterns, and hopefully as we go through the presentation, you'll learn to recognize these patterns that we see, and then you can see them and you start to make connections across multiple sites. And that's the key about unfinished. So that's the name of the presentation, and it's I was worried about this. It's not a comment on the state of the presentation, but about a week ago, I was getting worried about that. All right. You guys ready for Egypt? Let's look at some pyramids. This conference doesn't have enough pyramids in it, so we'll fix that. So you should all be familiar with this site. This is Giza. But we'll go through real quick here and orient ourselves. Great Pyramid, or the Pyramid of Khufu, early 26th century BC. Pyramid of Khafre, Middle Pyramid, mid 26th century BC. This is the dates that is given by archaeology. I'm not going to do too much about dates. This is really about pattern recognition and looking at similarities across sites. But the pyramid we're really interested in here is the Little Pyramid, the small one, the third pyramid, also known as the Pyramid of Menkaure. So let's take a look at this thing. The reason I wanted to get here, so when we went to Egypt with Ben the first time, I was like, dude, we need to get over to this pyramid. I want to see this thing. And it's because of these, the remnants of the casing stones on this pyramid. The other two pyramids also had casing stones. They were made of Tura limestone, which is a very hard kind of limestone, but these are of granite, and that makes them stand out. Granite is very hard, much harder than limestone, much more difficult to work, much heavier. It's very dense. And yet somebody was casing this pyramid with this very difficult material that is actually sourced from around 500 miles away up the Nile. So you can think of these casing stones, and we kind of realized this as we were walking around. You can think of the casing stones, these and the ones on the other pyramids, as a kind of roof. So when you build a house, you have all the walls and you have the interior structure, you have all this infrastructure, and you need to protect it from the elements. So you put a roof on it, and then you tile or shingle the roof. And those shingles usually have stone on them of some kind, whether they're tiles or if it's just regular shingles, it has bits of gravel in it, it's stone to protect your house from the elements, from the rain, from wind, from all the stuff that would degrade the structure of the house. So these casing stones on pyramids, they act in the same way. They build the pyramid with the core masonry, which is made of limestone. It's much softer than granite, and it is susceptible to degradation over time, much more so than the granite. So if you coat the whole pyramid in granite, or in a much harder version of limestone, then you're kind of protecting it. And unfortunately, these pyramids have acted as quarries for thousands of years for people to get this material. And these casing stones were highly valued because, again, the source of this granite was a long way away. So if you were nearby and you wanted a millstone made of granite, or you wanted an entry for your doorway made of granite, it's much easier to get it off the pyramid than it is to go 500 miles up the Nile. So let's get a little closer here. You begin to notice some patterns as you look at these casing stones. You'll see that they're not all the same. They're heterogeneous. The layers are similar, so you see the horizontal lines are the same all the way across, mostly. But the vertical lines are different, the sizes of the blocks are different. Some of them are tilted, they have different angles. So this is the first thing you notice, is that they weren't making it easy on themselves. When we build stuff with bricks, the bricks are all the same size. It's very easy. You can stack them up and you can make a cube of bricks, or you can make a wall. And it's very simple. You just put them up against each other. It doesn't matter what brick you use. But these stones are like puzzle pieces. But the other section that we're interested in here is this spot right around the doorway. That's the entrance to the pyramid right there. And there's this very interesting spot right there. This is what I really wanted to see. But first, let's take a closer look at the stones themselves. This kind of gives you the scale. So just look at that. When you're standing next to these, your head barely comes up to the top of the second layer of casing stones. These are enormous blocks, and they're deep too. They go deep into the pyramid to sit up against the core masonry. So we're talking, these are very heavy blocks to work with. And you'll also notice that they're unfinished. They aren't flattened. They have this kind of puffy or pillowy nature on the front faces. This is another good view. Shows you the scale again. So when you're standing up against this pyramid, the second layer of blocks is right here, and they're enormous, absolutely enormous. And maybe you'll also notice these nubs. There's a set of them right there. There's a set of them on the row above. You can see them here. And we'll see these across the sites as we go. There's also these. What are these? Reverse nubs, indentations. What are these for? It makes you start to think of well, maybe this is how they were maneuvering the blocks, possibly, moving them around. And then there's this. So even though these casing stones, the front faces, the faces that face outward from the pyramid, are puffy or unfinished, they're pillowy, where they sat up against each other, they were very finely finished. As you can see from these blocks used to sit up against each other. They're on the top layer, they've been separated, but you can tell how those blocks would have sat up against each other and they would have fit very well. This is another thing that we notice, another part of the pattern, is that we see that they're working with enormous stones, very difficult to work with material, and that they would set them up against each other without mortar, and the joins are usually so fine that you can barely tell where they are. And we'll see some of that later. The other interesting thing is that these faces, where they're sitting up against each other, are not always flat. I don't have any good pictures of this. I'm hoping to get some when we go back to Egypt. But sometimes the face of one stone will have this slight curve, and the face of the stone that it's sitting up against has a matching curve. Very slight. And this is just, it just makes you wonder. As a construction guy, I'm like, how did they do that? What tools are they using? So, this is the flat face around the doorway, one view of it. And you'll notice there is some hieroglyphs here. This is actually 19th dynasty graffiti. So it's almost, this is from 1800 years after the standard model tells us that this pyramid was constructed. So it has nothing to do with the construction itself. But again, look at the flat face. Just ignore the writing. It's graffiti. But look at the flat face. Well, look at where the flattened area ends. There's this radius. It curves upwards. And it makes you start to wonder, well, how are they doing this? How are they flattening this material? There's no obvious chisel marks. And we'll look at chisel marks later in granite. When they're there, you can see them. And that's the other thing, is that on the unfinished faces of these blocks, there's no obvious chisel marks. And we're told that these people were using chisels, stone tools. The chisels were made of copper. Working this kind of material with copper chisels is not something that's particularly easy to do. You kind of start wondering, how are they doing this? And the fact that there isn't any chisel marks on the unfinished surfaces makes you wonder. Because often you're told, well, they would use the chisels, and then at the end of the work, you'd polish the chisel marks off of there. Well, these are unfinished faces. So where are the chisel marks? They're not polishing the chisel marks off the unfinished part of the stones. So this gives you another view. You can see the radius there. Here's another couple of views of the right side. Again, note the radius, this curve upwards. And that makes you wonder, is there a tool that has this radius? Is there a tool that defines this radius? If any of you have ever seen a belt sander, like you can imagine a huge belt sander just flattening this thing out. I don't know if that's how they did it. I doubt it. But again, as a construction guy, I'm just like, how did they do this? And the amount of material that's being removed from this area is amazing. This picture shows you. Our buddy Josh there leaning up against it. Kyle took this picture. So Kyle's leaning up against the flattened face, looking at Josh. That's 18 inches, almost 2 feet of granite being removed from these stones. That's not a trivial task. If you took that amount of granite and just kind of broke it off one of those stones and put it on the ground, you couldn't pick it up. This is a lot of material. Hundreds, possibly thousands of pounds on some of the bigger blocks. Here's another good picture of the face. And I just want to show you this before we move on from this part, because this is going to have one of the details that we'll notice. It's right here. We'll zoom in and take a closer look. Look at this. So yes, as a construction guy, I look at this and I say, how did they do this? And why did they do this? There's no mortar. Again, it's dry laid. So these stones are huge, they weigh a whole lot, and they're setting them up against each other without any mortar, and the joins are so perfect that they're just like they fit perfectly, and yet they're willing to make these tiny deviations. And it looks easy, like they were just like, yeah, just drop the whole layer right there down a half an inch, not a problem. Okay, so we were looking at the north side of the Menkaure pyramid. Now we're going to go around to the east side, and you'll notice there's a square structure there. We'll look at that in a minute. But first, on the east side, there's also a flattened face. So at first, when we were seeing this flattened face on the front, we were thinking, well, maybe it's for the entrance. They were doing something with the door. You kind of need a control surface for your doorway. But no, there's a flattened face on the east side as well. There's no known door here. So that made us start to rethink, well, what are these for? What is the purpose of these flattened surfaces? And the last time we were at Egypt, we actually circumnavigated the entire pyramid, hopefully, looking for flattened faces on the other two sides. But on the other two sides, unfortunately, the rubble is still piled up against the base of the pyramid. So if there are flattened faces, they may be hidden under the rubble. But we did find some prism stones, in other words, facing stones that had an obvious angled cut that was cleanly cut that may indicate that there were flattened faces that have been destroyed. So it's possible that there was a flat face, at least one, on each side of this pyramid. One for each face, maybe more. And so you start to ask yourself, well, what are these for? What's the purpose? The other thing I'll point out real quick before we move on from this flattened face is this stone. It's got an interesting shape. So this may indicate something interesting structurally happening here. I don't know. I just wanted to point it out. It's cool. But, so why are you doing this? Why are they doing this? Let's take a look. So if you're an ancient civilization, you want to build a giant stone triangle in the desert, and you want it to have this very specific angle of 51 degrees, 20 minutes, 25 seconds for some reason. And then you're going to build the whole thing out of limestone core masonry. But you want to protect this core masonry from the elements, so you start stacking up granite blocks on the outside. The guys at the quarry are sending you the granite blocks with lots of extra material on them so that you can protect the outer surfaces of the blocks, so that as you're stacking them up, if you drop something down and it goes tumbling down, it doesn't damage what you want the finished face to be, which will be right about here. But then you notice, you start thinking about it, and you're like, well, if we get way up there and we're trying to maintain this angle of this finished face that's actually inside of the blocks that we're setting on, how do we check for that as we go up? So maybe while you're still close to the ground and you can set up some surveying equipment on a level platform, you set up some surveying equipment and then you flatten a section of blocks right there near the ground and define your angle. And then you can keep stacking blocks, because now you have a platform on the pyramid itself that's defining the angle that you want for the entire face of the pyramid. So that afterwards, once you've stacked the blocks up, you can check your work, make sure that the blocks have enough material so that when you do finally flatten the entire thing, it looks nice like this. So that's a possibility. Okay. This is the square structure that we saw in the Google Earth picture. This is called the Pyramid Temple of Menkaure, or the Mortuary Temple of Menkaure. This is supposed to have been built alongside the pyramid, like it was the same project. They're building the pyramid and this temple at the same time. But again, as a construction guy, we're looking at this and we're noticing how this temple butts up against the pyramid, and it's a little strange. It's not a very good job. Yeah. And if we're going with the idea that these flattened faces on the pyramid indicate that they intended to flatten all of the casing stones to finish the job, and they didn't finish it, well, this temple is butting up against unfinished work. So that may indicate that this temple was built much later, or at least somewhat later, by different people, an entirely different project for different reasons. Had nothing to do with the pyramid itself. Here's another look. It's just not a really good, it's not a good job. If you hired somebody to come to your house and you're like, look, I want an extension, and they just connected it like that, you'd be like, bro, you're fired. You gotta, no. Okay. So, staying on the Giza Plateau but moving to a different structure, I think this one is almost finished. This is the Valley Temple. This is a beautiful, amazing place. And look, so it's granite again. So the Valley Temple is constructed in a similar way. It is an interior structure, but in a similar way to the pyramid, there's enormous limestone core masonry that is cased in granite on the inside and the outside faces. Most of the granite on the outside is gone, but on the interiors at least, it still remains. So as you're walking through, it's just these beautiful rooms. They're really tall, and it's just beautiful stonework. But this stonework has been flattened. It has been completed. It probably was polished. It's just so ancient that the polish has been worn away. But look at the size of some of these blocks. Look at that thing. and this one on the other side. Other thing I'll point out is that guy that's in the picture, he's actually really tall. I mean, so he kind of makes this look smaller than it really is. But the other thing I want to point out about this block is this will define another point of data, another pattern that we're going to see in these sites as we look. And that is that this block actually goes around the corner. So we'll take a closer look at that. Here's the corner, and here's the block. It goes around the corner. So again, as a construction guy, you're like, what? I mean, you know, if you're looking at an inside corner of brickwork, none of the bricks go around the corner in modern times. And that is a gigantic granite block. Here's another corner in the same temple. Here's the corner itself. And this block on the top goes around the corner. This one goes around the corner. This one on the right goes around the corner. And this one on the left also goes around the corner. So that it's like all of them. They're all going around the corner, back and forth. Sometimes they alternate. Here's another look at another corner, a different one. And this actually shows you, it's not entirely clear in these pictures, but trust me, when you're there, it's very clear that the corners themselves are a defined line. It's a continuous tool mark all the way from the top of the wall all the way to the floor. It looks like a single mark, and you can kind of see it in this picture. It's got a different quality from the stonework around it, like somebody made it with a different kind of tool, and it has a radius. Like you could measure it and define it. It's like this was an inch bit, right? Possibly. But again, just to show you, here's the corner itself. This block goes around it. This block goes around it. And this one above that, and so on as we go up. And just in case you're in a little bit of doubt, there's this block. It is the corner. So again, as a construction guy, I'm like, what? How are they doing this? Why are they doing this? Well, maybe it's part of the construction process itself. Maybe that a lot of this stuff that we're looking at is just a natural progression of the construction process. So let's take a look at some diagrams again. Let's say that you're an ancient construction worker and you've got this order to build a nice rectangular chamber of stone. And you put in some massive limestone core masonry. Notice there's no door to this chamber, but just ignore that. And then you're going to line the interior with your granite blocks to protect it. And the outward-facing surfaces of these granite blocks are puffy, they're pillowy, right? They're not finished, just like what we saw in the pyramid. So your actual interior dimensions of this chamber are here in the blue lines. So now you go to the corners that you've defined with this square of blue lines. And by the way, this is a top-down view of the chamber. So you go to the corners, the 4 different corners, and you drill at the places you want your corners. And then you send Johnson in there with the magic granite removing tool. And also note, really quick, that none of these blocks, these granite blocks that are lining it, are going around any corners right now. But you send Johnson in there with the tool and you're like, okay, clean off these surfaces flat all the way to the drill holes so that it looks like this. And then you'll notice that you have 4 blocks going around the corners once you've done this So it may actually be that they have these blocks with extra material, like a padding, right? Because this is the thing, when you're moving stone, especially really heavy stone, you're often in danger of damaging it. So if you have sharp corners, if it's coming from the quarry with sharp corners, beautiful faces, and it bumps up against something, or one guy drops it, it's damaging the face that you want to be the finished product. So you send it from the quarry with all this extra material, like, it's like a padding on it. And then you can go through the entire construction process only revealing the faces that are part of the finished product right before you butt them up against something else or right before you finish the job. So the process of going through this process results in blocks going around the corners. It's a very interesting idea. And one more thing I want to point out before we move on from this temple This is just me illustrating the beauty of the joins. So I've got my hand there. There's actually a horizontal and a vertical joint here. They're almost invisible. The only way you can really recognize them is that these parts of the blocks, the edges, are a little more susceptible to damage, so they end up with these indentations and the discontinuity of the crystals in the granite itself. You notice that crystals will just end abruptly. Here's another view. This is an outside corner, and again, see how beautiful the joint is here. It's almost invisible. Okay. So, from Giza, we're going to go 300 miles up the Nile, down south, to a site called the Osirian. The Osirian is right next to the Temple of Seti I. This is a 19th dynasty structure. It's actually absolutely beautiful. It's above ground. The temple itself is above ground. It's enormous. It's beautiful. This is it right here. But the Osirian is here, and it's 55 feet below ground level. It's like a basement sitting outside of this temple. And it looks completely different from normal dynastic construction. As you can see, I'm standing up above the temple looking down in. Here's another view. And as you can see, it's so deep in the ground that it's actually in the water table. And the other thing that's interesting is we're just looking at the very top known level of this structure. This actually goes down very far into the ground. I've actually just been recently, I found another rabbit hole about this structure. Completely with all new information. So I'm still reading that stuff, but this thing is amazing. It was called the well. Possibly it was intended to be a well. There may be a spring beneath it that's got different water from the Nile water. There may be channels that connect it to the Nile. But all we can see for today is the top level. And now we're down inside of it. And you'll notice again, just the megalithic construction here, the size of these columns and the blocks above. And even the floor tiles, a lot of times you're walking around these places and you forget to look at what you're walking on, because some of the tiles are absolutely enormous, and they're going to be 4 feet thick and also 10 feet across. It's not a normal tile job. I love this photograph. So this, again, just shows you it's the beauty. There's something beautiful about this, but it's also strange. It's silent. It just stands there and makes you wonder, like, who did this? Why did they do it this way? What is the purpose? Just another view showing you again, I'm fascinated with how enormous these columns are, I have to admit. I just want to keep pointing out, they're really big. They're huge. And I'll just show you real quick the contrast between a normal, what we associate, like this is a dynastic temple on the right here. They're also beautiful, they're huge, but they're made with softer stone. Those columns that are very tall are stacked with what are called column drums, so it's a series of discs, right? So it's like you stack up discs and then you carve the column. But these things at the Osirian is just one piece. You're like, I want a column and I want it to be one piece. Here's another view. Note this strange dashed line on the upper right of the column. We'll look at some of these later, but this is evidence that people in ancient times were quarrying this stone. So they were stealing the stonework here. And they didn't quite succeed with this one, because the idea is you want to break it off clean, get those surfaces. This didn't work, as you can tell. But what we're going to look at real quick here is the base of this column. All of these have this. There's this interesting, like an indentation. The columns are sitting in their own, like little countersunk indentation in the floor tiles. Back to this column, it's also sitting in its own indentation, as you can see. I'm not going to draw on it, but I think you can see it there on the left. And then there's this hole in the middle. This is called the well. It's possible that this held a column. There's no remnants of any column that I'm aware of, but it has the same sort of features as the other column areas in that it's got an indentation, but then there's also this deep hole. So that made me start to wonder, Kyle and I talked about this, maybe the interface between these columns and the floor is not something as simple as this, which is what we kind of see on the outside, where the column is just set on the floor. But maybe it's actually something much more interesting like this. Something more interesting and complex, where the columns are just plugged in to the floor. So that, again, just kind of gives you an idea, a mind, or like a glimpse into the minds of the builders. Not only do they want these enormous megalithic columns, but they wanted it to be structurally sound. And you just think, well, if I set that giant block down here, it's not going to move. But they're like, nope, it needs to be countersunk and plugged in. Just make sure that it doesn't move. And it also just makes the whole job way harder. The other thing I'll point out about this structure is that it's weird to walk around in it. The pyramids are like this as well. When you're walking around in a dynastic temple, it's obvious that it's meant for people to walk through it. The hallways are wide, the columns are tall and beautiful, you can walk between them. It's kind of, you can just tell. And everything is covered in writing. So it's like every surface is speaking to you, telling you a story, showing you pictures. But then you're in places like this or in the pyramids, it's more like you're walking around in some kind of, like a system. It's a mechanism. Like people aren't really meant to be here except the maintenance guys. Maybe the maintenance guys are supposed to be down here, but if you went down there and the maintenance guy's like, what are you doing down here? Get out of here. It's like being in the basement of a skyscraper. And these channels that we're looking at here, they're full of water. These are very deep. So you'll notice that the guy standing on the left there, if you're trying to get around that column, you're just kind of like, yeah. And if that wasn't full of water, it would be like a 10-meter drop. Okay, this is a deep structure. So it doesn't really seem like you're supposed to be walking around in here, unless you know what you're doing. You got a jumpsuit on. So this photograph is taken, the one looking at the channel. I'm like standing underneath these ceiling blocks on the right. These are the only three that I think, the only three ceiling blocks that remain, the ones that are going across the top. And again, you stand underneath them and you look up and they're 40 feet above you and you're just like, oh my God, they're enormous. You can feel the weight of them is palpable, just their mass. As you're standing underneath them, you're just like, this is unbelievable. How do they do this? Well, we'll see. We'll take a look. He's asking if they're angled. Yeah, we'll see. The other thing I'll point out really quick, actually, let me back up, is that there's interesting angles with everything here. So you're asking about angles. The columns are all slightly tapered inward as they go up, and the walls are all slightly tapered outwards. Okay, which, again, as a construction guy, I'm like, man, that makes this job way harder. You can put a plumb on something, you're like, okay, it's straight. But no, it needs to be 1 degree out. And the columns need to have 1 degree tilt inwards. But it does this interesting thing with perspective, right? And it's perspective on the negative space. This is another thing that is the beauty of the design. It's so huge when you're standing in here that as you look up, you would have this perspective effect where it would look smaller as you looked up. The empty space looks smaller, but because they've tilted everything outward, it kind of looks the same. All the way, it just slightly offsets the perspective problem. And then it's a strange effect because you're like, wait, how high is that really? Because your brain is used to everything doing this as you look up. It doesn't because it's tilted out slightly. Okay, so let's look at some patterns on the walls. Again, you'll notice it's not quite as much as the pyramid that we were looking at, but these blocks are unfinished. They're a little puffy, they're pillowy. They're not complete. But you'll see that there's nubs right here. And I had to resist drawing a smiley face on this when I was making this presentation. I was like, no, I have to keep this serious. This is a serious thing. Okay. And then there's this section of the wall. There's a whole lot of interesting things. Lots of the patterns that we're going to recognize. You guys will see the nubs. You'll see the indentation here. And then there are these interesting things, these little inserts. So amidst all this megalithic masonry, they're also putting in these tiny little inserts, these stone inserts. Why are they doing it this way? Again, the question, what is going on here? What is the purpose? In some cases, we thought, well, maybe this is a fix for a damaged corner. Maybe that's what it is. But again, without seeing through the wall, you don't know how deep the inserts go. Do they go all the way to the back? Some of them definitely don't because they're in the corner, so you can tell it's just right here. Like it's intended to fix what would be a hole after you polish the stone. So they put it in there, and then you polish it, and you have a solid surface. But we don't know how deep these go. The other thing you'll notice is the level change in the layer right here. And it happens across this sort of central block. All of this is happening right around this little block in the, it's not little, but this block in the middle. So you've got a level change in the layering happening across the middle of the block, these little inserts, nubs and other things that may be for maneuvering. So there's lots of interesting things happening here, but again, part of the pattern that we'll see. We'll back out, same wall, lots of things maybe you're recognizing, nubs all over the place. There are also these indentations, these like scoop-looking marks. There's lots of these all over this wall, but I'm just pointing these out because they're real obvious, but they're like these vertical scoops, like bites taken out of the stone. And then I found this while I was making this presentation. I don't really know what this means yet, but I just want to point it out to you guys because this blew my mind. I'm making the presentation, I'm like, what is this? It's right here. Let's zoom in one more time. Look at that. So that's not it. And actually, I showed this to Kyle. I was like, bro, am I losing my mind? Is this like an artifact of this photograph? And Kyle went through his stuff, and he found another picture from a slightly different angle that shows the same thing. This is not it doesn't look like an insert. Like that block on the right has a tiny sliver of itself underneath the block on the left. So this may imply some interesting things about construction methods again, which I don't have time to get into today, but you wouldn't do this, I'll just say that you wouldn't do this while the block is on the ground before you put it up, because as soon as you set that block down, it's gonna break. If that thing's gonna break. So, yeah, I don't know what, but next time we go to Egypt, I'm definitely gonna get some close-ups of that thing, because I really wanna see what's going on there. Okay, so let's back out. We're looking at the same wall, but I'm standing above the Osirian again. And you'll see the patterns, but I just want to point out this particular one on this block. We'll zoom in, and you can see that this is the scoop marks. It's like a removal of material on this block. So you see that the blocks are unfinished, they're puffy, they're pillowy, but somebody was coming along the top edge of this block and removing material, and it's like there's 4 definite marks here. This doesn't look like chisels. It doesn't look like any kind of known stonework technique that we have. But it does look like they were intending to flatten this entire wall. They were going to flatten it out and polish it. And we actually know that that was their intention because they were working on it. This is the same wall underneath those ceiling blocks we were looking at earlier, and you can see somebody was coming along here with a tool and flattening this wall out, and they didn't finish the job. Here's another view of it. And again, you'll notice that the work up from the ceiling blocks coming down is so beautiful that it's flat, right? You don't see any tool marks. But down at the bottom where the tool, whatever it was being removed, like, you can imagine like somebody with a paint roller, and they're painting the wall. You start at the top, you come down, and you stop. You start at the top, you come down, you're going up and down. But the area where the tool is stopping work is where you see evidence of what the tool may look like. So you see this along the bottom here. Again, that there's like a common width, that the tool had a bit or a surface or a face that was using to work these stones. And then you'll see that it looks like the tool's being removed and it's leaving these tiny little vertical slivers of stone on there, which is, again, I just have to point out, not chisel work. It doesn't look like that. And one more thing about this area is this right here in the back corner. So let's zoom in. This block goes around the corner. So here's the corner, and here's the block. So now we have pretty much direct evidence of what we were talking about earlier, the idea of why these blocks go around the corner. We know that these blocks had unfinished, like extra material, that they were coming along and removing it, and this block now goes around the corner in the back there. Okay. So, from the Osirian, let's go another 200 miles up the Nile, down south, to the quarry, the source of a lot of this granite we've been looking at. This is the quarry itself. It's a huge outcrop. There are other granite quarries, but this is the most famous one because of this thing that you can kind of see in here. This is the unfinished obelisk. And we'll take a look at this a little later. This is another part of the pattern. But first, let's take a look at some known tool marks. People have been using this quarry for thousands of years, not just the dynastic Egyptians, but the Greeks, the Romans, people who came after them, definitely using this quarry. These are chisel marks. This is a particular kind of chiseling called comb chiseling. And this is usually associated with finish work. Like, in other words, you want these sort of all the lines to be right next to each other, and it kind of gives this cool finished texture. So it's a little strange that we have that kind of finish work on a wall in the quarry, but nevertheless, that's chiseling. But you can see this is other Roman chisel work. The lines don't have to be continuous, but that's what chisel marks look like. Then we have marks like this in the quarry, all over the place in this area, circling them and pointing at them here. This is an interesting technique, and we saw these. This is what caused the dashed lines in the Osirian that we saw. This is a technique called feather and wedge. It uses tools like this. You make a series of holes in a line in the stone. You drive these in, and it splits the stone along the line, and then you end up with tool marks that look like this on the split stone. Now, this is obviously modern work, so the marks are narrow and deeper, farther apart. But the stuff we're looking at in the quarry is the same thing. You got a dashed line, they're driving wedges in, and they split the block. And I'll point out that when you're splitting stone like this, you don't end up with puffy stones or stones with nubs. It just splits the block, and you end up with a rough surface, usually pretty flat. But elsewhere in the quarry, we see marks like this. This is not chiseling. This is not feather and wedge. This is something else. And they're all over the place. Here's another set. Sometimes they form this interesting grid like this. Sometimes they form these sort of step patterns like this. So on this, I'm looking down the series of steps, and these can be 18 to 24 inches in width. So these are not small marks here. Now I'm down at the base of that same set of marks looking upwards. That shows you the pattern. It's just very strange. Like, what were they using to do this? What tool made this? Here's another set. This one has interesting characteristic of from the upper right down to the lower left, there's this gradual change in angle. And this is something that, as a person who's operated machinery, when you're digging machinery that's on an articulating arm like a backhoe, you see stuff like this because the tool itself that's doing the work is on the end of a long arm that has a rotating center. And so as you're reaching out and digging and you're changing and you're digging in different places, you end up with slight changes in angle because of the nature of the tool. I don't know if that's what they were using, but that's what this looks like. This may give us clues on the kinds of tools they were using. Here's another set. This is another part of the pattern, is that these scoop marks will be continuous over long distances. So you can see as you're looking at this wall, you're looking at the base there where the stone is a sort of dark gray or light gray, that the scoops are continuous as they go up to the left and all the way up the wall. You can follow them all the way up, one after the other. All right, so let's look at this thing. This is an amazing object, the unfinished obelisk. 137 feet, 1,200 tons estimated. No one actually knows because it's still part of the stone. It's never been removed. So I guess they did some estimates on how big it would have been, and they estimated the weight. So 1,200 tons, it's really huge. Here's another view of it right here. And just to compare, the largest that I could find, the largest standing obelisk that Egypt ever erected, is called the Lateran obelisk. It's now in Rome. It's much smaller than it used to be, but at its full size, it was 455 tons. So less than half of the estimated weight of the unfinished obelisk that's still in the quarry. So one thing you wonder is maybe it's unfinished because they were just like, dude, we're not going to be able to get this out of here. But I don't know. Maybe. That's possible. And we'll see other places around the world that might have this same characteristic. But it doesn't look like they were not confident in their work. They were already making it obelisk-y. This is the front of it. And notice the trenches along the side. You see the scoop marks down in there. Here's another view from the base. You can see, again, the deep trenches. The trenches are very regular. It's very interesting. And you see the pattern of scoops. There's some deeper ones and some shallower ones all along the obelisk itself. This is my favorite picture of it. Look at this thing. It's amazing. Look at the people in the back up by the tip. This gives you the scale. It's absolutely enormous. And you see these marks all over it and around it, in the trenches, the work nearby. So let's just zoom in at the base here. And I just want you to see that these scoops, again, they're regular. They follow a line from the base going upwards across the bottom of the trench, also from the side and going down the trench. It's like a grid line almost. I would love to get a full, complete, like high-resolution LiDAR scan of this thing because I wonder if there's a rough grid going all the way up and all the way across where the lines come along the side, down the trench, across the bottom, up the side of the obelisk, across the top of it, down the side, across the bottom of the trench, and up. Like it's continuous all the way across in both directions. It looks like it is, but we'd need a detailed scan to find out. And unfortunately, they won't let us get down in the trenches on this object. So, well, I think Ben got to get down in there once. But that's Ben, he gets lucky. We didn't get to go down in there. But what's really quick before we move on from this, when you go to this site, the first thing they do, before they even let you see the quarry itself, you get funneled into a little building and you get to watch a propaganda video where they tell you how this was done. And you're forced to watch this. And it's kind of fun, because we're just going there like, all right. And Zahi Hawass is showing you that they had these pounding stones. They're like the size of cantaloupes, made of dolerite, a green stone. And they're like, yeah, they're just, because they know that some people are going to go into this quarry and see these scoop marks and be like, that's not chiseling. What did that? And they're like, well, you just, So this is Kyle trying it out. Lots of people try it out, and trust me, you try it for a little bit, and you're like, no. Nope. This is not, I'm sorry. And, they're showing you in the video, like, yeah, you can do this, and you can remove material, and people have done experiments, but none of them have gotten down underneath the work and laid down and tried to do it from here on their back. None of them have gotten in a really narrow trench that's deep and just tried to pound on the side of something. How much dust, especially if you've got a bunch of guys in a row, all of them doing this, you're not going to be able to breathe, you're going to die. So, yeah, the answer is no. But it's a fun propaganda video. Okay. In other places in the quarry, you can get down in the trenches alongside work where they were removing a lot of material. And it's the same kind of scoop mark. So this is, on the left is the work, the block that they were trying to remove. On the right is the trench wall, and you can see that there's this beautiful pattern of scoops. This is another view of it. So now I'm on the block looking at the trench wall, and the pattern of scoops going along. It's got this lovely step pattern. They're very regular, and a little difficult to see in this picture, but the lines continue down the side of the trench from each scoop. This one's much easier to see it. You can see that the lines are continuous. And again, how deep this is. This was a big piece of work they were going to remove out of here. Here's another view of the wall. You can see the lines are continuous all along. And, of course, in the base of the trench, they go down across the bottom of the trench, and they start to go up underneath the block that they were removing, which is on the left there. Here's another great view. Look at this. So I've never, I'm in construction. I've never worked in a quarry, but I'm like, what is this? I would love to get a quarry person down in here, like somebody who does modern quarry work. How do they do this? What tools do they think they were using to do this? And this, again, shows you that whatever this tool was, if it was a single tool making these marks, it was big. As you can see from the scale there with the guy standing in. And also, just to point out, I think we're all kind of in agreement that they weren't using pounding stones at this point, but if you were using pounding stones, and Ben makes this point great in some of his videos, those ridges that are in between each scoop mark is the area you would attack if you were working with blunt force manual labor, because those are the easiest places to break off stone. It doesn't make any sense for guys that are pounding on the granite, removing it, by pieces of dust, to not hit those obvious extrusions where maybe you could break off a big piece instead of just doing it like powder. So what kind of tool were they using? Again, I don't know, but I think we can define here what they're not using. And it wasn't those pounding stones. Okay, so real quick, from the quarry, we'll go all the way back down the Nile to the Serapeum. And I looked for a horizontal map of the Serapeum. This is a great one. Thank you, Gregor. I don't know who Gregor is, but he made a great map, so I just want to give him credit there. But this is it's an interesting place. There used to be structure above ground. Now it's just the below ground stuff that we see. They call them the greater galleries. Lots and lots of strange things about this, but I just want to show you the object inside. There are 24 or 25. Now Ben's got me confused again because he said 25 yesterday. And I was like, I think it's 24. I don't know. There's a lot of these boxes. This is a good picture, just trying to give you the scale. Again, with everything in Egypt, you can look at the pictures all you want, but until you go, you don't really grasp. They're so big that you can't grasp the scale. You think you do, and then you go actually see it, and you're like, whoa, that's a lot bigger than I thought it was. But this is Yusuf standing next to the block there, to the box. And there's just a bunch of these. They all have slightly different characteristics, but you see that there's a pattern. They're faceted. Some of the lids are deeper, some of them are shallower, like this one. But they also have these scoop marks on them. And Ben mentioned this the other day. They're removing material. And the scoop marks are polished. So this is part of the finished work. So this makes it clear that whoever was making these, they wanted this particular shape of the box and the lid with the faceted surfaces, but for some reason, whatever they were doing with those scoop marks was more important than maintaining the beautiful surfaces of the box itself. So this makes you start to question, okay, so what is the purpose of the box? What are they removing material for? Well, one idea is that they're scooping out weaknesses in the stone, tiny fractures. And that makes you start to wonder, well, what is the purpose of that? They really want this box to be solid and secure against something that over time may cause those cracks to extend. So you scoop them out, and then they've polished them. This is another view, let me back up. This is another view of the same box. So now you can see the scoops on the top, and this is with the light slightly different. You see that there's scoops on the side here as well, same box. This is another one. This shows you a little better the polish. Everything's so dusty in here that a lot of times it's difficult to see the polish. But this is Kyle putting his hand in some scoops right on the forward edge of the facets there. And you can see the polish, it's reflective. Here's another one, a big scoop taken out of the top there for some reason, and then polished to this beautiful, like granite countertop quality. Here's another one, it's difficult to see, but they've taken a big chunk out of the back right corner of the lid. You can see that it ends back there. This one, they've taken a huge chunk out of the entire front top edge of the facets and then polished it. This one is another one just to show you the scale. So even though this box is sitting on the original floor and the Ministry of Antiquities has built a wooden floor above that original floor, you can still walk down next to this box and walk underneath the lid while standing up. It shows you how big these objects are. More for scale. This is Kyle, totally doing legal stuff, not doing anything illegal. Still definitely legal. Down inside the box here, just doing some science, completely legal. But that shows you the scale of the interior surface sections of the box. It's big. But you also see the width of the walls of the box. So these things are meant to be sturdy. It's like built like a safe. And they're all in this complex of hallways that's dug into the ground. So when you start asking, well, how are they getting these boxes in here? How are they moving them into their little alcoves? Well, some people say, well, maybe they put the boxes in before they put the roof on. Well, no, this is dug out of the bedrock. There's no putting the roof on. They dug tunnels into the bedrock, and then each box had to be brought in, moved down these long hallways around the corners, which is a difficult operation, and then brought in and then set down in their individual alcoves. And as you can see, once again, they didn't finish the job. This box is in the hallway, and it's kind of in the way. So again, if you order a new bed and they come and they bring it, and they just kind of like, well, it's heavy, bro, and they just leave it in your hallway. But again, note that, I just like to point out that lots of things have been reconstructed and fixed in Egypt because it's ruins, so they will move things around. They'll stand statues back up. They kind of glue them back together. Well, this box is still there. No one has tried to move this. They built a floor around it. You can see the wooden floor just kind of goes around the box. It's easier to build the floor around the box than move the dang thing. So that's Kyle again standing next to the box. That's where you got to kind of squeeze past it, So again, it's just interesting. I think this is fascinating. They didn't finish the job. They're almost done. This is like one of the last boxes if you were going to complete the complex and put this in its alcove. All the other boxes are in place. They're in the process of moving this one. You can see that it's a little wonky. It's not finished. It's not polished, right? So this shows you that they were intending, just like with the other boxes, they moved them into place and they finished them on site, like in other words, in their alcove, polish it right there, and then it's done. So again, it's not puffy or pillowy like some of the granite facing stones we've seen, but it does have protective material on it. In other words, if it was polished already and you're trying to move it down the hallway and you scratch it, you bump it against something, you damage your finished surface. But because they don't finish it until it's in place, the finished surface is protected. But for some reason, they didn't finish the job. All right, one more look at this, and Ben kind of went through this yesterday, is the way that they date all this stuff. Multiple things, but this is one of the ways, is the glyphs and the writings that are on a couple of the boxes. This is the one that's the most famous. You're allowed to get in down here to see this one because of the writing. But you can kind of see that the lines aren't really that great. It's not really that well done. Somebody was clearly just scratching their way through the polished surface, which is weird. Again, I look at the way that they built these and I see, well, the polish, the finish is the last thing you do. So if you're going to carve glyphs into it, you do that before you've polished it. And you do the polishing work after all that's done. So the fact that this is completely polished and then somebody was scratching on it just kind of indicates to me that maybe this is not contemporary with the box itself, that this is done much later. And you can just see that the lines aren't really straight. It's not really that good of a job. And in some cases, they don't even really connect. You could see he's getting frustrated. He's like, this is really hard. I have a crappy copper chisel and this is really hard stone. He just throws the chisel down, I'm going to bed. Okay, so let's take a look really quick. We're getting close to the end here. Around the world, now that you've learned to recognize patterns, this is Ollantaytambo in Peru. So do you see the vertical scoop marks? Notice the enormous megalithic style, the sort of heterogeneous, dry-laid cyclopean masonry, the beautiful joins. It's got a kind of this organic feel. There's nubs. You're seeing the patterns. This is also Ollantaytambo. Obviously, the job's not complete. They didn't finish this site. Blocks are in the process of being moved. The ones that are in place are beautifully joined, and then they've got these interesting, I just want to point out that these are not, these nubs, this is not easy to make these. You have to remove all of the face of the block around it to get this extrusion. That's a lot of work. Here's another site in Peru. Look at how beautiful this is. And also notice that right around that entryway or the doorway or the window, whatever it is on the upper level there, that the blocks begin to get bigger as they approach the opening, and then there's all these nubs around it, which may indicate something about what they're for, what the purpose is, and again, the minds of the engineers and builders that designed these retaining walls, because that's what these are. This is holding back the dirt of the mountainside. Sacsayhuaman in Peru. Again, the blocks are pillowy, they're puffy, they're heterogeneous, they have vertical lines, and possibly the work is unfinished. Here's another view of the wall. Notice the two indentations at the lower left, the base of that giant block in the middle there. But again, the scoop marks all over it. This is on the other side of the world, on the wrong hemisphere, but it looks like the same kind of work, the same tools, the same methods, the same mentality, the same ideas. Easter Island, the Moai. The biggest one that would have ever been made is still in the quarry, similar to the obelisk. If that unfinished obelisk would have been completed, it would have been the largest one ever made. There's obelisks all over Egypt on the Easter Island. There's moai all over the place. If this one would have been completed, it would have been the largest one ever made. It's enormous. And just like the obelisk, that they were already making obelisk-y in the quarry, this is moai-y. It's got a face. It already looks like a moai statue, which is weird because, again, when you're thinking about the building and they're like, let's protect these surfaces of the finish, and yet when they're making these sculptures, they're already making it look like a moai while it's still in the quarry. It's just very strange. Baalbek. For a long time, this block on the top here, the one on the upper right, was thought to be the largest stone block ever cut. The stone of the south, the stone of the pregnant woman. But then some German archaeologists went in there and started digging around it, and they found that it's sitting on top of two even more enormous blocks. This shows you the scale. You see those people there. Who thought they were going to move those? Well, somebody clearly could move at least the one on the top because they stacked it on top of those other two. This is not, again, as a person who's moved some heavy thing, nothing like this, but you just start to think like, dude, what equipment can handle this? Where's the infrastructure around this to pick up these enormous weights? If you go look at like places where cargo ships coming in and they're bringing up all these boxes full of cars and all this stuff, there's enormous infrastructure for the cranes that move in over those boats and unload them and load them. They're on tracks. They have all this mass. Everything is flat. You have this enormous concrete base that digs deep into the ground so that you can have all this infrastructure to move. There's nothing like this around these. It's just rough countryside. So how are they doing this? This is in China. This is called the Yangshan Quarry. This is a very strange place. I don't know a whole lot about it because it's in China. I would love to go there one day and see it. But again, I'm including it because it's got some of the patterns and the story about it is similar in the sense that they say that they were going to build a big monument and they got most of the way done and they were just like, bro, we're not going to be able to move these. It's too big. And I just have a hard time with that because I've done construction. You can kind of tell long before this, you're like, bro, what are you going to move that with? I don't think you would get this far down the job before you would realize we can't pick this thing up. And just to show you the scale of this same object, look at this. Who thought they were going to pick that up? But in other areas, you see it has nubs. So it does kind of match the pattern a little bit. But yeah, I would love to get here and see this place. It's very strange. I've got a bunch of pictures of it just because it's so strange. But also, in Japan, they have interesting megaliths. These are like, I don't know, reverse scoop marks. I'd love to get here and see this as well. This is a megalith in the bamboo forest, or a monolith thing. They also have enormous, interesting stone blocks in walls that have this sort of heterogeneous cyclopean nature. They also have these beautiful platforms. These things are ancient. Look at the style of construction, how the corners are tilted inwards and the blocks of the corners themselves are much more massive than the blocks of the walls. And this makes you start to think like somebody knew what they were doing. This is an island with earthquakes. This thing is ancient and it has survived all the earthquakes. So somebody knew what they were doing structurally, and I think it has to do with the inward tilt and the massiveness of those corners. But I would love to get here again and see this. So, all over the world, we see these interesting patterns in certain sites that seem to be anomalous. Flattened surfaces, beautiful details like tiny changes when they're using enormous megalithic blocks. Blocks going around corners, using very difficult, hard stone, often that's sourced from very far away from where the structure is. The joins are beautiful, sometimes almost impossible to see. The natures of the structures themselves are difficult to understand. It doesn't look like a temple, it looks more like a machine or maybe some kind of system. And part of this conference is talking about a cataclysm that happened in our deep past. And with Ben's work that he's been doing on the vases, we now have good reason to maybe go back and take a look at people who may have been doing very precise, very excellent work on stone in the very deep past. So maybe these structures, these unfinished things in the quarry, were people in the deep past doing beautiful work, and they were interrupted all over the world by something that destroyed their civilization, and all of their projects were left unfinished. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Very good. Wow.